Hello and welcome back to Beaver Hunter Scale Models. In this video I finally finished my Panther Tank maintenance diorama with painting and placing the figures in it. And because I was somehow limited with resin figures for this kind of scene, I had to use plastic kit figures, what didn't make the job easier. If you are curious if and how I was successful, stay tuned for a very detailed figure painting video. These are the sets I choose the figures from, the matching Tamiya kit to the tank and a set from Miniart. And this old Masterbox kit I have in my stash for decades in the case I may need it someday. And because I expected the figures and especially the heads to be in a bad quality, I got me these resin heads by Legend Productions. From BERGSWERK Modell came these beautifully printed dogs. I wanted to add one of them to the scene, but because they all looked great, this was a really tough decision. Then it was time to get started with the figures, and I started with building the two Tamiya ones. They were exactly like I expected them to be. Some cleanup of casting residues and smoothing out these areas with a sharp blade in my hobby knife, some sanding here and there, and a lot of patience. I redefined some details like the hands by deepening the gaps between the fingers to make them look more like hands instead of fish fins. After cleaning the parts, I could grab me my Tamiya plastic cement again after a long time and glue the parts together. And with Tamiya extra thin cement I smoothed the surface I worked on with my hobby knife and removed casting residues and redefined folds of the clothes. Like I said, the heads were the parts which showed the ages of the kit the most, with casting residues all over them and the ears, so there was just one solution. But to be honest, the heads by Legend Productions were pretty disappointing, because of almost more casting residues than the plastic heads, holes in the cap's peak and air bubbles in the surface. And this is either a shrinking head or a try to supply different sized sets. But now I had to try to get the best out of them, and I used my knife to mark a good spot where I could place my Dremel drill and make a hole into the torso. I then used a milling attachment to widen the hole and remove the complete neck area with only the collar left. And the last fine detail work was done with my hobby knife. I then cleaned the resin head I chose as good as possible and removed material from the neck to get into a conical shape. And of course I checked the fit constantly in the progress. When I was happy with the fit and position, I grabbed me my favorite super glue and glued the head in place. And that was the basic build of the Tamiya figures, and I am glad that they hide themselves by looking into the engine compartment. I then chose the two left guys from the Miniart set for this scene and again started the basic assembly. Here I was expecting better quality, but again ended up cleaning the parts and replacing the heads because they weren't fitting well and didn't look that good. And to make things worse, I ended up with huge gaps because of the fit of the parts, which was, well, not good. For example, the hands had no holes for the hammer and I had to drill them, but it wasn't like the hands were big enough for that. So I had to repair fingers and close gaps with putty later. The only figure I built out of the box was this old Masterbox one, what really surprised me. Even the head was nice enough after not more cleanup like I had to do on the resin ones, but therefore it had a better fit and I decided to use it instead of a replacement. Before I finished the figures by closing the gaps, I test placed them on the scene and played around with the positions and checked if everything was working out like I was hoping it would. When I was happy with every position, I removed the figures and finished the scene with gluing last details to the tank, gluing the tank to the base using wood glue, gluing all details to the base which could be placed there without getting me in trouble later, and then turned my attention back to the figures. Filling gaps on plastic kit figures is a common task because there is just no way to glue them together and ending up with more or less big gaps. So this was an expected job, and I therefore mixed me green stuff 2-part putty and rolled it into thin noodles. I used a moistened toothpick for placing and pushing the putty into the gaps. To me, this is the best tool for that because it won't stick to the putty when it's wet, and it's great for removing excess by scribing it gently away. The bigger gaps on the Miniart figures needed some more modeling than just filling, and here I had to leave my comfort zone as I'm clearly no modeling ninja. And here I extended my tools by a silicone brush and different dentist tools to achieve the best possible result. But again, I am happy that these areas will be hidden by the posture of the figure and the tank in the diorama. When the putty had time to dry and get hard, I drilled holes in the figure's feet and glued some 0.5 mm wire into them. Like that I could later place him on corks easily. But first I had to clean and wash them carefully in soapy water to get rid of dust from sanding and grease from my fingers from touching them, allowing the paint to have a better grip on the figures. And with my airbrush I sped up the drying time by blowing them dry. Now I could shorten the wire to the desired length and place the figures on corks. Like this I could handle them better while painting without touching them. Finally, time for paint, and I started with priming them in a warm brown tone. I applied the primer in several runs in thin layers to not cover any details. As I had to paint several figures in different colors, I chose the pre-shading this time over a pre-coloring, and as a first step for that I sprayed every figure completely black. And in the next step sprayed the lighter color from above in a flat angle, so only the raised spots and areas which would be hit by light were lightened up. This was pretty much a straightforward routine job on the standing upright figures, but turned out to be more complicated on the bent over ones. Naturally, the light would fall onto their backs, with the underside being pretty dark, and as weird this looked to me, it should be the way it is done, with the light coming from above. So I had to be faithful and continue just like this against my doubts to get into the brush painting stage, which came next. With the pre-shading done, I could start adding some color with glazes. I herefore always use a bottle cap, which I collected in hard work myself, place 1 drop of paint in it and fill it up with water. Like this I always end up with a consistent paint-water ratio, and after stirring and checking the opacity I was good to go. This light green paint was used to glaze the green overalls of the Tamiya figures, and I applied the glaze with a bigger soft brush. Because of the thinness of the glazes, the first layers looked like not much. But that's important to not cover the pre-shading, which is supposed to act as a roadmap for highlights and shadows later. And it's a good idea to not overload the brush and unload it on a piece of paper towel before touching the figure, because I don't want to flood it completely with the thin paint. The unavoidable excess which is pooling in the folds and crevices is removed with a dry brush, so it doesn't dry out there and cover the shadowed areas. The amount of layers needed depends on the color of the paint. Light paints usually take more than dark paints, and the brand you use. Some are more pigmented, others are more thin. In some cases you may be satisfied after 3 layers, in other it can take you 8 to 9, and it's always worth taking the time and build up this effect slowly. And because the paint is highly diluted with water, it dries super fast and you can continue with the next layer almost immediately. And this is my result after around 8 layers with this lighter green paint. The color is clearly visible but not covering the pre-shading completely. It has a chance to show through and let me know where to put the highlight and shadow paints later. And it's always nice to see some first paint on them and the black and white area getting smaller. In this way all figures were base painted using the glazes method, and the two Miniart mechanics got field grey working pens. Here 6 layers were needed until I was satisfied and the pooling excess paint was removed with a dry brush. And on the Masterbox figure I want to try to create a black Panther crew uniform using the paints from an older 2nd generation AK set I have for years now, using a dark base color as a starting point. All shirted figures receive grey blouses, and although it first looked like nothing happened brushing grey over a black and white pre-shading, the effect here built up slowly too. And when glazing 2-part figures like these, it's a good thing to work clean. For example, the dark grey from the pants would be hard to cover here with the lighter grey if I would have been more messy and applied the darker color over the shirt, partly because I painted messy. After the glazes I wanted to redefine the shadows and highlights to achieve more contrast and make the figures look more crispy. In general I like to start with the shadows, and for that I used a dark brown acrylic paint and diluted it with retarder around 50%. This was then brushed in every deep spot in folds, crevices or other shadowed places. From time to time I used a bigger soft brush, slightly moistened with retarder, and with that smoothed out the edges of the just painted shadow and blended it into the surface of the figure. And as I had the dark paint in my brush, I used it in a slightly thicker mix to highlight seams by repainting them. When the seams are sculpted like on these figures, I only use dark brown paint for that. In some cases, depending on the uniform, it can be good looking to add another thin stripe of lighter paint next to the dark seam to increase the effect. The same was done on the two Miniart figures, redefine shadows and then repaint the seams. Another benefit of diluting the paint with retarder here is that if a mistake was made, I could easily remove it with another retarder moistened brush and start all over. On the blouses of the two figures I also used the dark brown paint for shadows and outlining details like the suspenders. But because of the light base paint, it is a good idea to keep it thin. For the Masterbox figure I changed the paints and used a mix of the darkest paints from the uniform set for painting the shadows of the pants. The process was the same however, but the paint more matching. Because the base paint of the pants wasn't that dark at all, black would be too dark for my taste. And with my mix I again repainted all deeper areas, but because he is standing, there were less places for this. If you are curious about the diorama these figures are for, please check out my channel where you can find videos to building the Panther Tank and the diorama base itself. For the shirt on this figure I also wanted to try different paints because, like I said, the dark brown wasn't matching very well with the grey. So I grabbed me some medium dark paints from the set and with that painted the shadows in the folds and crevices, and I was more happy with the result here. When painting shadows, one should always paint highlights too, for contrast and to avoid ending up with too dark figures. The highlights were mixed from the base paint by adding a lighter yellowish paint to it, and this mix was then applied, again diluted with retarder, so it stays more translucent and workable longer, with a chance to blend it into the surface of the figure. A good way to apply the paint is to not to paint just an area with that paint, but to make constant brush strokes in the same direction. Like this, we can create some kind of texture with the brush strokes itself, and the edges of the painted areas are not that hard, but more irregular, just by the use of the brush like this. And I hope that is understandable and makes some sense at all. And because the first highlight wasn't light enough for these figures presenting their backs directly to the sun, I made a second round with an even lighter mix and repainted the most exposed areas and folds where the most light would hit. The same was done on the pants of the Miniart figures with their matching base paint lighted up. On the Panther uniform I again used the lighter paint of the uniform paint set, matching in color and brightness. Again, because of the figure standing here, there were not that strong light areas on the pants like the bandit figures had. And of course the same was done on the shirt. I here again used paints from the uniform set, and in general I think this figure's shirt turned out a bit nicer compared to the shirts where I used the dark brown paint. So it was logical I used the highlight paint on these two figures too to save what is to be saved. Because the transitions on the black pants turned out a bit too hard for my taste, I made two thin glazes over it. This smoothed out the edges and turned the whole look a bit darker again. Of course, it is very important to remove the excess with a dry brush so the glaze isn't covering the previous work. With that, the uniforms were basically done, and I quickly prepared leftover details like the hammer's wooden handle for later refining, and painted suspenders, boots or belts with different browns or blacks. This progress I showed more detailed in my earlier figure painting videos. Now I could finally move on to the most exciting part, skin tones. For the skin tones I had my paints and shades I used on former figures, and I was pretty happy with them. But I felt that there was still room for improvement, and this was a perfect project for some experimenting with new tones with that much figures to paint. So I split the figures in 3 groups, each base painted with different skin base tones, and then used new shadow paints I never tried out before on all of them to see how the shadows would look on the different base tones. Like this I could find out which combination would give me a good result with being also pretty fast. And these are the paints I used here. On the left are the tones from which I mixed the basic skin tones plus AK's cork, which was my basic skin tone for all previous figures, and I wanted to see how the new shadow paints would work on it. In the middle are the paints I used for painting shadows. In the past I used brownish reddish tones for that, what wasn't bad at all, but the figures looked always a bit dark to me. So I wanted to try out some new, flashy tones, although this might look very strange and fancy right now. And on the right are the paints I used to create the finishing glazes to give the last touches. And last but the most important, retarder for diluting the paints like on the uniforms. To keep this process a bit more simple and easier to follow, I will demonstrate my steps on this figure, where I used AK's cork as a basic skin tone and make a comparison of the results later. The shadow and highlight paints were all the same, just the basic skin tone varying. And I started with base painting the skin areas with diluted paint to not covering any facial details and the pre-shading completely. I then made a reddish pin wash, so to say, to emphasize details and give the skin a first hint of flesh. When this was dry, I started applying the first shadow. I therefore added some magenta to the base paint and applied it to the darker areas of the skin. Here the slightly visible pre-shading came in handy again, as it showed me where these areas would be. As the next step, I added some purple to the base paint and used it as a second shadow. This darker tone was only applied in the most shadowed areas, like the lower cheeks, under the chin and eyes, and around the neck. Like always in the whole progress, I dilute the paint with retarder and therefore can blend it into the previous layers by using a dry or retarder moistened brush. After the shadows came the highlights again, and with a lightened up base paint I painted all raised to light exposed areas. And as always, don't forget to blend for smoother color transitions. With an even lighter mix I applied the second highlight, and as this paint became lighter, the painted areas became smaller. Only the more exposed areas like the forehead, cheekbones or nose were painted with this mix to highlight the more exposed areas of the face. And with the lightest paint, the third highlight was applied, but only very sparingly on the most exposed areas, which would catch the most light. And by the way, this paint is also good for painting details like fingernails or hand knuckles. To unify all the bright highlights and dark shadows and smoothen transitions, I made a glaze with the base paint, very thin diluted with retarder. And it's a good idea to remove excess paint so nothing gets covered when the paint is pooling in the crevices. To add a bit of a flashy touch, I made a very thin glaze with pink. This gives especially the lighter areas a more lifelike look. But this glaze has to be very thin to not end up with a Play-Doh look. And again I used retarder for diluting it, so I have more time to work with the paint and maybe remove it if the effect is too strong. Now came the finishing touches, and I here started with a red glaze, again very thin. This was applied into the shadowed areas and gave them a more natural flashy look. The main areas were the cheeks, the sides of the nose, around the eyes and under the chin. And the lips also received a coat and therefore looked more real than using, for example, thicker pink paint on them. And these thin glazes blend even better into the surface when using a dry brush to smoothen them out. With a dark blue glaze, even thinner than the red one, I applied a 5 o'clock or bearded shadow around the chin and cheeks. But as these guys are not on the front line for weeks and for sure had the opportunity to shave, I kept it more subtle here. And as a last step for the skin tones, I applied a yellow glaze on the areas looking directly into the light, like the forehead of this guy. This adds a nice warm sun-kissed touch, and obviously not every figure received this glaze, as some were bent over and not looking into the light. I then quickly painted the hair and the caps, but to avoid ending up with an hour-long video, I don't show this in detail here. If you are interested in how I paint the hair on a figure, I recommend my last figure video, where I show this process in detail. What I show here are only the last finishing steps with glazes. Painting the eyes is actually pretty easy with these steps. I grabbed me my 000 brush by Winsor & Newton with a very fine tip and use it to apply a dot of brown oil paint from Ammo's oil brusher, as this paint is slightly thinned. And after the paint had a few minutes to sit, I grabbed me my 00 brush, slightly moistened with thinner, and with that I can correct the shape and size of the dot to make it fitting to the figure's eye. I can even easily remove the paint and start all over again if it came out completely useless. Like this, painting the eyes is so easy it almost feels like cheating with countless tries. And here is a promised comparison of the other skin tones I used. This mix came out a bit too light for my taste. Maybe I just overdid it with the shadow paints, which came out more pinky and purple here compared to the other figures. Maybe it's worth making some more tries with more subtle shadows here. This mix came out better and I like it way more. It's slightly darker than the previous mix and a bit lighter than AK's cork I used on the example figure. So I think this has a potential I will use it more often in the future. And of course, as these figures have arms and hands, I painted these two in the same order like the faces. The shadow mixes were applied in the darker areas, the highlights on the lighter ones, just like I did it on the faces when I used these paints. For the finishing touches and finally get them off the corks, I added some metal effects in the form of AK's metal pigments onto the tools and metal parts. These were then polished with silicone brushes and created a nice, not too shiny metal surface. For the earlier mentioned dog, I decided on the Great Dane. It just looked too good, and because of its size and muscular look, it was a perfect fit for me to this scene. I here again used the paint set for the black Panzer crew uniforms and started with a dark base coat, and then with getting lighter tried to create a fur-like texture. As I'm no expert for fur and short fur is even tougher to paint, this was more like trying around and finding out again. So maybe the special part should be more seen as a documentary than a tutorial. Basically, I tried to create a fur-like texture with short brush strokes. And with a unifying glaze in a dark paint, I tried to smoothen these brush strokes and the hard-looking texture. And as not being an expert animal painter, I was satisfied with the look of this beautiful beast. Then I finally could start gluing everything together. I usually like to glue the figures to the bases with the wires still in their feet to get a stronger connection. But as I glued them onto the plastic tank and the concrete ground here, I decided on using only some super glue. Every detail I placed on the diorama or tank was glued too, so nothing will ever move again and stays where it is supposed to be. And this little fellow is my secret favorite of the scene. Because I wanted to finish this scene so bad, I almost completely forgot a very important step: dirt and grease. Obviously, as mechanics, these guys could not stay clean, as good and sharp looking the painted uniforms were. So I grabbed me some dark enamel products and applied it on areas of the working overalls where dirt and grease should accumulate. The guy in the Black Panther pants only received a light dusting, as he is kind of a foreworker to me, and dark enamels on a dark paint wouldn't make much sense to me. And with that light dust paint I also added some to the other figures. And after the enamels had some time to get dry to the touch, I used a brush slightly moistened with thinner to blend the paint into the suits and clothes. Obviously this would have been a lot easier when the figures were still on the corks, but it's also not impossible to do it now, and better late than never. Also, it can be easier this way around to match figures to the ground when they are already placed. And lastly, this was repeated on the hands and arms, as they would be weird mechanics or magicians when their hands stayed clean when doing this kind of work. And now I can finally say, and with that, this diorama is done. Almost exactly 1 year after I started building the tank, this scene is completed. As a hobby scale modeler, I can never say how long a project like this will take me. But as I prefer aiming for the, for me, best possible result, instead of rushing a project, I can honestly say that it was worth taking this time. Anyway, if you are still here, thank you very much for watching my videos. I really appreciate it, and if you could maybe learn a thing or two, this is even better. The next project will be a smaller one and hopefully won't take me another year, but I can already say it will be figure related too. Of course there will be armored models too in the future, but after this long project I need to refresh my motivation with some short and nice quick projects. But until then I will now sit here a bit more and enjoy the view in the display case. If you like what you saw, I would be happy if you support me by subscribing, and again thank you for watching. So all that is left to say is stay safe, and until the next time.